It started in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning. My daughter took my phone, tapped a few things, and slid it back to me like it was no big deal. She said, "I added myself to your bank account, just in case something happens to you." The way she said something happens to you made it sound like she was already planning for my absence. I nodded because arguing felt exhausting, and honestly, I thought maybe this was what responsible daughters did. For a week, everything seemed normal, until my grocery card declined in front of a line of strangers. The cashier asked if I had another payment method, and I laughed it off like it was a glitch, but my hands were shaking when I walked outside. I called the bank, and the agent said, "Your co-owner added spending limits." Co-owner. That word felt heavier than mother. When I got home, I asked her about it, and she didn't even pause her typing. She said, "You were buying too much stuff. I fixed it." Fixed it, like I was a broken appliance. That night, I logged into my account for the first time in years and saw 3 transfers I never made, spaced out so neatly they looked intentional. They were sent to her account. I called the bank again, and they confirmed it was legal because she was a co-owner. Legal. That word felt colder than betrayal. When I asked her why she was moving my money, she leaned back and said, "Relax, Mom. I'm managing it better than you." That's when I realized this wasn't help. This was a quiet takeover. And she thought I wouldn't notice. The next morning, I drove to the bank instead of arguing with her because fighting never changes paperwork. The lobby smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner, and everyone there looked busy with their own quiet emergencies. I sat with a young banker who called me Ma and Am, in that polite tone people use when they think you were fragile, and I asked him to explain exactly what my daughter could and couldn't do. He pulled up the screen and said, "As a joint owner, she has full control, but you still have the right to open a separate account in your name only." That sentence felt like oxygen. I didn't tell him why I needed it. I just nodded. And asked him to open it quietly. No mailed statements, no alerts sent to family contacts. He raised an eyebrow, but said, "We can do paperless and private access." While he typed, he mentioned something else, something my daughter never mentioned when she helped me. He said I could redirect my Social Security deposits and pension into the new account with one simple form. I signed it with a steady hand, even though my heart was moving faster than my pen. That was my first win, and it wasn't emotional. It was factual, documented, and real. When I got home, I didn't say a word. I cooked dinner, asked her about work, laughed at a joke she made, and let her believe she was still in charge. Over the next week, I started noticing things I ignored before. How she checked my spending history like it was her dashboard. How she asked before I bought anything over $50. How she said things like, "You don't need that, I'll order it cheaper." It wasn't kindness. It was surveillance wrapped in concern. I quietly gathered every statement, every email, every notification, printing them at the library so nothing showed on my home printer logs. Then one afternoon, she walked into the kitchen with her phone in her hand and said, "Hey, your balance is getting low. What did you buy?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was managerial. I looked at her and said, "Groceries." She frowned and said, "Next time, run it by me first." Run it by me first, like I was a teenager with a credit limit. That night, I transferred the first chunk of my redirected income into the private account and watched it land there on the screen. She didn't get an alert. She didn't see it. She thought the system still belonged to her. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't just reacting. I was moving quietly in a direction she couldn't track. It took exactly 9 days for her to notice something was off, because control only feels invisible until the numbers stop behaving. And one evening she walked into the living room with her laptop open and her eyebrows pulled together like she was solving a puzzle that didn't want to be solved. She said, "Mom, your balance should be lower than this." The way she said should made it sound like the account was a machine she had calibrated. I asked her what she meant, and she turned the screen toward me, pointing at a chart that tracked my monthly deposits and spending. She said, "You haven't had your Social Security hit this account in over a week. Did the government mess something up?" Her tone was concerned, but I heard the edge underneath it, the quiet panic of someone losing access to their dashboard. I told her maybe the system glitched, and she frowned like she didn't like systems she didn't control. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and checked my private account, watching the balance grow like something alive that only I could see. Then I did something she never thought I'd do. I pulled my credit report. It took me 20 minutes to figure out the website, but when the report loaded, my stomach tightened in a way I hadn't felt since childbirth. There were 2 credit cards I didn't recognize, opened in my name, with balances that looked too neat to be accidental. Both cards had been used mostly online, mostly on things I never ordered. I called the issuing bank, and the representative confirmed the applications were submitted from my daughter's email address, using my information with her listed as an authorized user. "Is this fraud?" she asked gently. I didn't answer that question. I asked for copies of everything. When the documents arrived by email, I printed them at the library again, sliding the pages into a folder labeled Insurance so my daughter wouldn't think twice if she saw it. 2 days later, she confronted me again, this time in the hallway like she didn't want the walls to hear. She said, "Did you move your deposits on purpose?" I looked at her and said, "Why would I do that?" She stared at me for a second, like she was recalculating her entire mental model of me, then said, "It's just weird. You need someone managing this stuff." Managing this stuff. Managing me. That ass when I realized she didn't see herself as stealing. She saw herself as upgrading the system, and I was the outdated software. That night, I called a legal aid clinic and booked a free consultation for seniors. I didn't tell her. I didn't Google anything on my home Wi-Fi. I didn't leave any digital footprints she could trace. I just listened to the lawyer explain that joint ownership doesn't give someone the right to open credit in your name without explicit consent, and that unauthorized use can be reported without pressing criminal charges. That detail mattered because I wasn't interested in blowing up the family. I was interested in quietly rewiring it. When I hung up, I opened my notebook again and added a new section titled Leverage. Because control isn't about yelling. Control is about documentation, timing, and knowing exactly when someone thinks they're untouchable. She escalated quietly, the way people do when they think yelling would expose them, because 2 mornings after our hallway conversation, I opened my banking app and the screen asked for a password reset I hadn't requested. Then a security code was sent to an email address I didn't recognize at first, and when I checked the account settings, her email was listed as the primary recovery contact and mine had been moved to secondary, which meant if I ever got locked out, I'd need her permission to get back in. And when I asked her about it over breakfast, she didn't even deny it. She just said, "You forget passwords all the time. This is easier." And that word easier hit me differently, because it was always easier for her when I had less access. And that afternoon she texted me while I was at the pharmacy and said, I froze your debit card for now. Too many charges yesterday. And I stood there with a bottle of blood pressure meds in my hand, realizing my own health care now required approval. And instead of arguing, I walked across the street to a different branch of the same bank and asked to speak to a senior fraud specialist. And when I showed him the printed credit card applications, the email logs, and the account recovery changes, his expression shifted from polite to precise, and he explained that while joint ownership allowed spending, altering security settings without consent, and opening credit lines crossed into unauthorized access, and he gave me a form called account control reversion, which allowed the original account holder to reclaim digital authority without notifying the co-owner until the change was processed, and I signed it slowly, carefully, feeling like I was signing a map back to myself. And before I left, he added a temporary monitoring flag that would alert me to any further credit activity in my name, not her. And when I got home that evening, she was in the living room with her laptop open and her face tight in a way that told me something had already changed, because she said, "Did you reset the login?" And I said, "The system did." And she stared at her screen like a pilot watching instruments go dark. And that night, she tried to add a new recovery email and got a denial message, which she showed me with a laugh that sounded forced. And she said, "Banks are so annoying." But I could see the shift in her shoulders, the realization that control can be reversed with paperwork. And then she did something I didn't expect. She said, "We should probably formalize me managing your finances, like power of attorney or something." And she said it casually, like she was suggesting Netflix settings, and that was the moment I understood her endgame wasn't just convenience, it was permanence. And that night, I called the legal aid attorney again and asked about power of attorney abuse, and she told me a quiet truth that felt heavier than any argument. Once someone has it, it's hard to get it back. I thanked her, hung up, and added another line to my notebook under leverage. Never sign what you can't undo. Then I opened my private account, transferred another chunk of funds, and set up automatic payments for all my bills from the new account, meaning my old account, the one she watched, would soon look inactive. And the next morning, when she asked why the balance wasn't moving anymore, I told her I was cutting back. And she nodded like she was approving a budget she no longer controlled. And I realized something that felt like power. She thought she was locking me in, but she was actually helping me document every step she took, and documentation doesn't argue. It just waits. It took her 3 days to realize the account had gone silent, because people who monitor dashboards don't notice peace until it stops benefiting them. And on the 4th morning, she walked into the kitchen with her phone in her hand and said, "Did you close the account?" Like she was asking about a streaming subscription, not my life. And I told her I was simplifying things, and she laughed and said, "You can't just simplify finances, Mom." And I thought about how easily she'd simplified me. And that afternoon, she started asking questions she'd never asked before. Where I was getting cash, how I paid the electric bill, why the pharmacy charge wasn't showing up in her notifications. And I answered everything with soft half-truths. Because strategy doesn't require lies, it requires timing. And that evening, she sat across from me on the couch and said, "You're hiding money from me." And the way she said "me" made it clear she thought the money belonged to her management system now, and I told her I wasn't hiding anything. I was just handling my own expenses. And she sighed like she was disappointed in a project that wasn't following instructions, then said something that made my stomach tighten. "We really need to get power of attorney set up before something happens to you." And she said it with a smile, but I heard the subtext. "Before you realize what I'm doing." And that night I placed my phone on the table and recorded a voice memo of our conversation from earlier that day. because the legal aid attorney had told me that documenting coercion and intent matters, especially when power of attorney is involved. I was designing a firewall, and when I signed the initial trust paperwork, I felt something like calm settle into my hands because paperwork doesn't get emotional paperwork, just enforces reality. And when I got home, my daughter was in the living room, waiting for me, scrolling through her banking dashboard like someone watching a stock ticker. And she said, "You went to the bank again, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You really don't need to be doing all this alone." And for the first time, I didn't answer. Because I realized she wasn't afraid I thought make mistakes, she was afraid I thought make decisions. And later that night, I transferred the last major balance out of the joint account and watched the number drop to a level that looked almost empty. And I imagined her refreshing the app, waiting for something to move, and I felt no anger, no triumph, just clarity, because she thought control came from access, but access only matters when there and something left to control. She didn't stay calm when the numbers stopped answering her anymore, because control looks polite only when it's working. And 2 mornings after I emptied the joint account, she walked into the kitchen without saying good morning and said, "We need to talk," in that flat tone people use when they're done pretending. And she sat across from me with her laptop open, showing me the joint account balance that now looked like an abandoned house. And she said, "Where did the money go?" And I said, "I moved it." And she laughed once, sharp and fast, like she thought I was joking, then realized I wasn't, and she asked if someone had convinced me to do it. If the legal aid people were manipulating me, if I was being scammed by strangers who prey on seniors, and I told her I'd never felt more clear in my life, and that clarity made her more nervous than confusion ever could. And that afternoon, the bank called her directly because she was still listed as co-owner, and I could hear her half of the conversation from the hallway, her voice going from confident to clipped as they explained that major funds had been transferred legally by the primary holder and that privacy rules prevented them from disclosing details without my consent. And when she hung up, she came into my room and said, "You did this on purpose," like purpose was a betrayal. And I told her yes, and she asked if I was punishing her, and I told her I was protecting myself, and she shook her head and said, "You don't understand how complicated this stuff is." And I told her I understood exactly how complicated it becomes when someone else controls it, and that night she tried a softer approach, bringing me tea, asking if I was stressed, reminding me how much she'd done for me, and I listened. But I'd already heard from the attorney that gratitude can be used like a contract, and 2 days later, we sat in a conference room at the bank with a senior advisor I'd requested, and when he asked who managed my finances now, I said, "An independent trustee." And my daughter's face changed in a way I'd never seen before, because independence is terrifying when you expected ownership. And when I explained that the trustee would handle assets according to my instructions and that she would no longer have direct control, she said, "So you don't trust me?" And I said, "Trust doesn't require access." And the advisor nodded like that sentence wasn't emotional, it was policy. And when she realized the system no longer revolved around her login, she stood up and said she needed air. And I watched her walk out of the glass-walled room where everyone could see, realizing that for the first time her control wasn't private anymore. It had been replaced by a structure that didn't need her permission. She didn't come back from the bank meeting quiet. She came back strategic. Because 2 days later, my phone started ringing with numbers I hadn't heard from in years. My sister asking if I was okay, my cousin asking if I was making decisions alone, and an old church friend leaving a voicemail saying she heard I was being taken advantage of and I realized my daughter had moved from private control to public narrative, because if you can't control the account, you try to control the story. And that night, she sat across from me at the dining table with her hands folded and said she'd been talking to family because she was worried about me. And she said worried like it was a diagnosis, and she told me everyone thought I was being influenced by lawyers and strangers who did not care about me, and I told her I felt clearer than I had in years. And she smiled sadly and said, "That's what scares me." And that line was clever, because it framed my confidence as confusion. And later that week she asked me to see a doctor, just to make sure everything's fine. And I went, not because I felt unwell, but because documentation favors truth. And when the physician wrote that I was fully oriented, independent, and capable of managing my finances, I asked for a signed copy and filed it with my attorney, and then I played her the audio clip I'd recorded where she said, "We need power of attorney set up before something happens to you." And I didn't accuse her. I just asked her to explain what she meant, and she went quiet in a way that felt louder than yelling. And 2 days later, my attorney filed a capacity affirmation affidavit with the county, which publicly documented that I was competent and acting independently, and that meant any future attempt to claim I was confused would require her to contradict official records. And when she realized there was now a paper trail of her trying to gain legal authority, she called me into the living room and said, "Why are you doing this to me?" And I told her I wasn't doing anything to her. I was documenting what she'd already done to me. And for the first time, she didn't have a counterpoint, because documentation doesn't argue, it just sits there, waiting. She started acting nervous in ways that didn't match her words, because control leaves fingerprints, and she was suddenly aware of hers. And one night I walked into the living room and saw her scrolling through her phone with that frantic speed people use when they were trying to erase something, and when I asked what she was doing, she said she was cleaning up old messages to free storage, and I almost laughed, because storage had never bothered her before documentation did. And the next morning my attorney called and told me something that shifted the entire board again. Because with the capacity affidavit, the recorded coercion, and the unauthorized credit activity, I qualified for a financial abuse protective order, which wouldn't criminalize her, but would legally restrict her from accessing or managing my finances in any form without third-party oversight. And the phrase "without criminalizing her" mattered, because I wasn't trying to burn the house down. I was trying to lock a door. And 2 days later we filed the petition quietly, and she wasn't notified until the court processed it. And when she received the notice in the mail, she came into the kitchen holding the envelope like it was something alive, and she asked if I was trying to ruin her career. And I told her I was trying to ruin the situation, and she said I was making her look like an abuser. And I said, paperwork doesn't make anyone look like anything, it just records behavior. And that afternoon she called the bank to ask if she was still on the account. And I listened from the hallway as the rep explained that all financial access now required trustee verification and court compliance. And I could hear the silence on her end of the line through the speaker. Because when systems take over, personal influence evaporates. And that night she tried a softer tactic again, telling me she loved me, reminding me of childhood vacations, telling me she never meant to hurt me, and I listened. But I'd already learned that love without boundaries can turn into ownership. And the next week we sat in a small courtroom with wood-paneled walls and a judge who spoke like he'd seen this story too many times. And when he approved the protective oversight order, he didn't lecture anyone, he just stamped the papers and said, "This is to ensure autonomy and prevent undue influence." And when my daughter heard the words undue influence, she looked at me like she finally understood that influence can be documented. And as we walked out of the courthouse, she asked if this meant she was no longer allowed to help me. And I told her help doesn't require control, and that sentence landed heavier than any accusation because control had been her definition of help. And as I sat in my car afterward, I realized I wasn't taking revenge. I was installing infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't care who gets emotional about it. She chose a family gathering for the confrontation because control loves an audience when it thinks it can win. And 2 Sundays after the court order, my sister hosted a backyard barbecue where everyone pretended nothing had changed. But tension has a way of showing up before anyone says it out loud. And halfway through the afternoon, my daughter walked over to me while I was sitting near the patio table and said, "We should talk," in that clipped tone she used when she wanted control without a scene. And I said, "We could talk right there," and that was the first twist. Because confrontation loses power when it doesn't get privacy. And she glanced around at the cousins and neighbors pretending not to listen, and lowered her voice anyway, saying the court order was humiliating and that people were starting to ask questions. And I told her questions come from actions, not paperwork. And she said I was painting her as a villain. And I said I wasn't painting anything, I was framing it. And that line landed heavier than I expected, because suddenly my sister stopped flipping burgers and started listening. And then my trustee arrived to introduce himself, a calm, middle-aged man with a leather folder and the kind of neutral presence that felt like a firewall in human form. And he shook everyone's hands and said he'd be working with me going forward to ensure everything stayed transparent and independent. And the moment people heard the word independent, their expressions shifted because independence reads differently than family conflict. And my daughter tried to pull me aside again, but my cousin asked her why I needed a trustee if family was handling things. And my daughter hesitated for half a second too long before saying she just wanted what was best for me. And that half second felt like the crack in a glass wall. And later, when the trustee explained in simple terms that his job was to protect my autonomy and prevent anyone from influencing my finances, I watched the group slowly recalibrate their assumptions. Because suddenly, this wasn't a mother-daughter fight. It was a documented autonomy decision. And when my daughter said she felt pushed out, I told her in front of everyone that being pushed out and being supervised are not the same thing. And the silence that followed felt like a recalibration of gravity. And in that moment, I realized she had counted on family dynamics to tilt the narrative. But systems tilt rooms differently. And when people hear words like trustee, court order, and autonomy, they stop gossiping and start respecting. And as the afternoon went on, people started asking me about my plans instead of her, and that was when I saw it in her eyes. The moment she realized the story she'd been telling quietly had just been replaced by the one I'd documented out loud. The shift didn't happen with another argument. It happened with paperwork and quiet realization. Because 2 days after the barbecue, my trustee called and asked if I wanted to review the long-term structure plan. And when he sat across from me at my dining table with his leather folder open, he explained that the protective order and revocable trust could be upgraded into a distribution framework that separated affection from authority. Meaning my daughter could still inherit whatever I chose, but she would never again control timing access or decisions. And as he spoke, I could see how carefully the system had been built to remove pressure points, because pressure always flows toward power, and power had just been relocated into neutral hands. And when my daughter walked in halfway through the meeting and saw the diagrams on the table, she froze like she'd walked into a blueprint of a building she no longer owned, and she asked if we were talking about her, and I said we were talking about the future. And she sat down quietly for once and listened, while the trustee explained how funds would be released on schedules and milestones, not at anyone's request, and how a third-party auditor would review transactions annually, and how even I couldn't casually change the structure without independent review. And that was the twist that landed hardest, because she realized this wasn't just me taking control. It was me giving up impulsive control in favor of permanent systems. And later that evening, she sat beside me on the couch and said she never meant to take over, that she just wanted to make sure I was safe. And I told her safety doesn't require secrecy, and help doesn't require passwords, and she nodded in a way that felt more honest than defensive. And then she asked if there was still a place for her in my plans, and I told her there was always a place for her as my daughter. But the system would never depend on her presence or absence again. And she looked at the folder on the coffee table like it was a map of a future she couldn't edit. And the next morning, she emailed the trustee directly asking how she could stay involved without violating boundaries. And when he replied with volunteer roles and observer status options, I saw something shift in her tone, because for the first time, she was asking how to participate instead of how to control. And that afternoon, I signed the final structural documents, not with anger or satisfaction, but with the kind of calm that comes from knowing no single person could ever lock me out of my own life again. And as I watched the ink dry, I realized the revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't cruel. It was architectural, because when you redesign the structure, the old power dynamics collapse quietly without needing to be confronted again. The change didn't show up in a dramatic apology. It showed up in small, awkward attempts to exist inside a system that no longer revolved around her. Because a week after the structure was finalized, my daughter showed up with a notebook and asked the trustee if she could sit in on a planning call. And the way she asked, careful, measured, almost formal, felt like someone requesting entry into a room she used to own. And during the call, she barely spoke, just listened, while he explained how distributions would be managed, how audits would be logged, and how my preferences were documented in a way that didn't require anyone's interpretation. And I noticed how different it felt to have my life explained in policies instead of personalities. And later that afternoon, my sister called to ask if I was cutting everyone off. And I told her I wasn't cutting people off. I was cutting pressure out. And that line traveled faster than gossip ever did, because by the weekend, relatives were asking about trustees and trusts like they were asking about recipes. And when my daughter overheard me explaining that the system protected me even from myself, she laughed softly and said, "You always did like backup plans." And for the first time, that felt like a memory, not a critique. And that evening, she offered to help with paperwork for a local senior center fundraiser, not as a manager, not as a gatekeeper, but as a volunteer. And I watched her navigate tasks without trying to centralize them. And it felt like watching someone learn a new language. And then the next twist came when the trustee suggested a community advisory panel to give input on charitable allocations. And he asked if I wanted to nominate family members, and I nominated my daughter, not as a controller but as a voice among others. And when she saw her name on the draft list, she looked at me and said, "So I still get a say?" And I said, "You always had a say. You just don't have the only say." And that sentence felt like the final translation of everything we'd been circling around. And that night she told me she'd been reading about financial abuse and control dynamics, and she didn't realize how quickly help can turn into ownership. And I listened without interrupting, because growth doesn't need witnesses, it just needs space. And as she spoke, I realized the system I'd built didn't just protect me. It gave her a framework to learn without hurting me again. And when I went to bed that night, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Safety that didn't depend on anyone's mood, memory, or morality, just on structure that worked even when people didn't. The public announcement happened on a Tuesday morning, The kind of day that feels ordinary until it becomes permanent. Because the senior center posted a short article about the new community advisory panel and the trust-funded programs, and my name was listed as founder, while my daughter's name appeared among several advisors, not highlighted, not centered, just one voice among many. And when she showed me the article on her phone, she smiled in a way that felt different from before, like she was proud without needing ownership. And later that afternoon, the trustee called to confirm that the first charitable distributions had been released according to the framework, scholarships awarded, and grants approved without any family intervention. And as he spoke, I realized that for the first time in my life, my money was moving according to my values without requiring anyone's permission or interpretation. And when my daughter sat beside me on the couch and asked if I ever felt scared giving up personal control to a system, I told her systems don't get tired, systems don't get emotional, and systems don't decide what's best for you without telling you. And she nodded like she was finally hearing the difference between love and leverage. And that evening she cooked dinner without checking my account, without asking what I spent, without opening any dashboard, just talking about her day like a daughter instead of a manager. And as we ate, she said she understood now that she'd crossed a line she didn't see, and that she thought being responsible meant taking over. And I told her responsibility means making sure someone can always take themselves back. And when I went to bed that night, I checked my private account, saw everything exactly where I'd placed it, and realized the quietest revenge I'd taken wasn't against her. It was against the system that let anyone erase me without paperwork, because now nothing in my life moved without my voice attached to it. And when I looked at the trust documents one last time, I didn't feel anger or triumph, just calm permanence, because control can be taken, but structure can too. And I had built something that would keep me visible long after anyone forgot who tried to manage me. She thought she owned my money. I built a system that made sure no one would ever own me again. If you enjoyed this quiet revenge story about control, dignity, and taking your life back, hit like and subscribe to Payback Files Stories. New emotional payback stories are uploaded regularly. Comment below. Would you forgive your child or build a system that never lets them control you again?